Welcome to Word on the Block, the series that takes a deeper dive into blockchain and the emerging technologies that shape our world at the intersection of business, politics, and economy. It's what we cover right here on Forkast News. I'm Editor-in-Chief Angie Lau. Well, we've been talking about space a lot. A lot of people are thinking about how blockchain can be integrated into mining for the resource-rich asteroids and minerals that exist in space. Well, our next guest, Brian Israel, thinks about that a lot too. He's currently a lecturer at UC Berkeley Law on space law and blockchain, but formerly he was co-founder of Consensus Space, a subsidiary of Consensus that was acquired Planetary Resources, a company, a blockchain based company that looked at using blockchain as the world looked to space to mine raw materials. And Brian Israel joins me right now. Brian, welcome. It's great to see you.
Thanks so much, Angie. Pleasure to be here.
What should we be thinking about when we look to the stars? It really, truly is the final frontier. It is the future. What is in our future right now?
Well, I think deeper exploration of our solar system and even human settlement of the moon and planets like Mars is in our future, but really space is ever present in our present as well, in ways that we probably don't take for granted and don't think about, as we rely on an ever increasing range of services, from GPS to weather forecasting, to the pretty imagery in Google Maps and the like, and those services are growing. You may have seen headlines that Elon Musk's company SpaceX is fielding a so-called mega constellation of satellites in low Earth orbit to provide broadband internet. Amazon has a rival constellation to provide broadband internet. Which will be great as far as sort of blanketing every square inch of Earth in internet, but also creates challenges as space is large, maybe infinitely large, but the area around Earth where these satellites can provide useful services is relatively limited. And so it's an exciting time in space because we are seeing new applications and new entrants, new kinds of actors. Whereas at the dawn of the space age, it was the province of governments and really two superpowers. There are many more governments involved. There are many more companies and universities and non-governmental players from an increasingly diverse range of countries that are involved, which is wonderful. And so there's this new dynamism. Of course, it creates governance challenges as well. And really, I think the most fundamental of them is, well, there is this space in which there is no sovereign who is in charge of space, and so how do you get a single set of rules of the road for all these satellites moving at 17,000 miles an hour approximately around Earth, and that becomes quite a challenge.
And so then, what is the role of blockchain here?
Well, I think it's really a question about the roles of blockchain, and I think a lot of them are like many applications of blockchain are theoretical at this moment, and are really just starting to take hold. So there's the traditional intuitive sort of applications of what blockchain does well. In terrestrial economies, it could do well in aerospace for things like supply chain integrity and things like that. Personally, where I think it adds something new, a capability that's not just marginally better, but entirely impossible before, is in enabling what I think of as private ordering among operators in space, allowing operators to enter into private contracts to make enforceable commitments with each other in ways that was difficult, bordering on unworkable before. And I think that particularly as it becomes increasingly difficult for sort of the top-down approach to governance of working everything out on the international plane and having governments extend these rules out to private operators, doesn't scale very well to the present diversity in number of spacecraft operators, I think there is a lot of demand for a sort of governance technology to allow these operators to make enforceable commitments to do the things that they know are in their common interest. And I see smart contracts as providing those opportunities. Maybe not immediately right now. I think there's, as anyone who works with the technology knows, it has great promise and can be clunky in its present implementation. But you can see the arc, or at least I can.
No, I do too, in that, you take a look at the mess that's Earth right now. We have COVID, we have geopolitical tensions, we have US-China trade disputes that have extended beyond and into now technology. And there's just a lot of territorial rights, trade disputes, and things like that. In space, it truly is a non-sovereign entity, as you said. Everybody is there. Governments alongside private enterprise are in space. And so then how do we tie back down to how we want to do business with each other and to play fair? Essentially, that's what the rules are that we're trying to create. It's interesting to hear that blockchain, at least in terms of smart contracts, can tie back the relationship, at least the business relationship between two parties, back down to earth, so that everybody plays by the same rules, essentially.
Yeah, and I think one way that one dimension of blockchain that I think is transformative really comes into focus if you think about what's hard about sort of traditional legal contracts when you have, say, parties from a dozen, 24 different countries. Of course, a contract has value. It's enforceable because the legal system of a nation state will enforce it. And when you have parties from many countries, it becomes very difficult, sometimes impossible, to agree on, well, whose country's legal system is going to have jurisdiction over this contract and enforce it. And it introduces all manner of business risk and uncertainty, whereas smart contracts dispense with that. The rules and the consequences are hard coded to you don't have to worry what a foreign court is going to do. You can look at the at the source code and have a pretty good understanding of what will happen. Of course, you can code it. You can make the wrong kind of arrangement. You can fail to foresee something that you wish you would have foreseen, but it removes that level of risk. It introduces other hiccups as well.
Yeah. Hiccups like what?
Well, for one, I think smart contracts work best for commitments that are relatively objective and objectively, verifiable, which is not everything. I personally see a value in using smart contracts in a hybrid way to use arbitrators as an oracle, to have human arbitrators in the loop, in the oracle loop, and then you still have the value of the sort of automaticity of enforcement of smart contracts, where you're not having to then go into the court that has jurisdiction over the party you just want a judgment against and sort of enforce it against assets. This transfer of value is automatic. For that to work, though, at least as far as, maybe there's a limit of my imagination, but at least as far as I know, that would require all the parties to a contract to basically lock up a substantial amount of value in the contract as a sort of escrow.
An escrow.
That might not be commercially that palatable. If the parties aren't used to doing that in their regular course of business.
Or that might be a tough thing to do if it's about future earnings or future income. So this is really fascinating. What I'm hearing is that you could actually source code what essentially is terms and conditions of a contract, and that the flow of money can transfer, or goods and services can transfer between two companies if if A, then B. So if A, goods are delivered, then B, payment is made. But the hiccup, as you said, is, that's easy when you are talking about when planetary mining, for example, how much of this specific raw material was actually mined and then delivered to a location. Okay, so that's very binary, it's very clear. But the hiccups come when, well, I'll say I'll do something, and then the shades of gray. Well, I did that, but you didn't do it the way that I wanted it to do it, and then there's stuff like that. But in space, right now, we're still working on what is still fairly binary. But what are the applications, the hiccups that you see that's occurring in space that would be fascinating to understand?
Well, so I think the example you gave is a great straightforward example of if you sort of put on your science fiction hat, or at least gaze a little bit into the future and imagine a whole sort of supply chain based on celestial body resources, and so that's sort of easy to envision, especially if transactions are sort of negotiated between robots, 1.5 times the distance between the Earth and the Sun from Earth, where there's a long sort of delay in communications. That you can see the advantage of the smart contracts there. But I've also been thinking more in terms of can smart contracts, or at least as the technology matures, enable, say, satellite operators to make enforceable commitments to each other, almost to self-regulate. And so as a as a thought experiment, consider that a critical mass of the world's satellite operators understand that it's in their sort of rational long-term business interest to adopt a certain measure on the disposal of their satellites at the end of their mission, so that so they don't become debris, they don't become junk, right. And they don't sort of limit the long-term usability of these orbits. So that measure costs money. It takes fuel to bring a satellite down. It takes, it's more expensive to design and build a satellite to have that capability. And so if for an operator to do that, it will be a competitive disadvantage if its competitors don't do that. And so it's a class of collective action problem. And the traditional way for the operators to solve that collective action problem in this admittedly simple thought experiment would be to lobby their governments to say, this is the rule we want, please enact it, to negotiate a treaty on the international plane. And then the governments that are party to that treaty would adopt national legislation and regulation that would make.
I mean, you're talking about the equivalent of carbon emissions right now, the problem of carbon emissions on Earth.
Well, right, and I think that that's a carbon credit trading. Exactly. I think is another thing I think about, where I see a different. That's a great example, and gives me an opportunity to sort of lay out a different dimension where I think blockchains can be transformative. So if you think about carbon credit trading regimes, they're territorial. They're limited to a jurisdiction. So and even sub-state jurisdictions. So California has a carbon credit trading regime. British Columbia has one. Mm-hmm. They wanted to interoperate. And so they were trying to work out an agreement so that a company in California could trade credits with a company in British Columbia. So as you grow the network effect, the value of the credits, the value of the regime, the value of participation grows. But if you think about what it takes to make it possible for any company to trade credits with anyone, it requires this massive web of international agreements and international administration. And then if you think about something like a blockchain network, you think, well, you don't need that because it's not territorial. What you have
in space. Now we're back in space again. It's not territorial.
In space or for carbon credit trading. I think if you have credits represented as tokens on a blockchain network, what you are placing your trust in is you essentially have a set of rules that are transparent about how these operate, if this then that, and you place your confidence in almost virtual certainty that the rules will execute in that way. And I think that allows parties to transact with each other without regard to what country they're coming from. That's not to say, like, if the country prohibits that activity, that's another matter. But it's without those countries having to get together and link up their various regimes. And
but it does take a market leader. It does take a market leader, like say in space. You need a market leader who will only do business with another firm that agrees to abide by the rules that it sets. And hopefully it's one that says this is good for everybody. It's good for space. Less space debris means less things falling down to Earth, means more space in our orbit so that satellites that are working aren't damaged or hit by other satellites that are no longer working or is garbage. It's a good thing that we have less garbage in our orbit as well. So does it take a market leader to serve in that function?
I absolutely agree. And I don't see, this technology as a sort of magic bullet. I think of it as another governance technology, a new governance technology. So in our toolbox, we have treaties, we have sort of traditional legal contracts, and I think we will have, or soon have, a viable, a new tool that will have a different set of trade-offs. But that when, particularly if you think about this international space where there's no territorial sovereign at all, which is a vacuum in some respects. Sometimes it's easier if you think about who sets the traditional rules of the road, like literally what side of the road do you drive on. Well, it's easy because there's always a sovereign, and that's literally the definition of sovereignty. Within your borders, you make the rules, not a thing in space. And so then what? So it's a new medium for operators to make rules that they think would best facilitate their long-term interests. Now, another downside or sort of weakness in that is these regimes I envision are based on sort of voluntary contracting. They're based on a critical mass of operators perceiving their interests as better served inside this regime and sort of voluntarily contracting in to make themselves bound by it. But without that, it's not very efficacious.
Well, I think it boils down back to the people on Earth. How do we want our companies to reflect our values? We're seeing that with ESG. We're seeing that with sustainability goals. Increasingly, activist investors are also taking on the hat of people like you and me who decide to vote with their dollars and their investments and or their crypto, but essentially demand social responsibility from their firms. I think it really boils back down to us here on Earth and how we want to set the rules of the game. And certainly blockchain can enforce that investor agreement that I potentially could sign in the future.
I think that's right. And we're seeing this phenomenon play out even with space junk, to use the precise term of art. There's an initiative called the Space Sustainability Rating, which is based on the LEED certification in the building sector for energy efficiency. And satellite operators will be able to voluntarily submit their operations to be evaluated and get a rating. And this is a thing because these operators care about having that rating, and they care about having that rating because the stakeholders care about the sustainability of their operations. You brought up another point that is, I think, central to my interest in sort of the long-term potential of smart contracts, and some of what we did, some of the research we did at Consensus Space, and that is, what can we as individuals, how can we effectuate our values. We can vote with our dollars. Does blockchain allow us a new and better way of voting with our dollars? And one of the sort of theoretical potentials that's exciting to me, although I think just that, probably theoretical, is this idea that blockchains would allow people around the world united by a common concern or goal, whether that is climate change mitigation, whether that is doing inspiring things in space, to pool their resources, to find each other, to organize, to put in what are relatively small chunks of money individually, but in aggregate, when you have a truly global pool of contributors, what you get is a pot of money that is more on the scale of what a government would field. And that was something that, the founding vision of Consensus Space was to build a global citizen space-led space program, a space program like a NASA or a European Space Agency or JAXA. But unlike those national organizations that are accountable to, they're sort of controlled by the governments and their appropriators, this would be controlled by a global community of token holders who would put in relatively small amounts of money for tokens and control these space missions. And so in the course of validating that, we did a lot of interviews with space enthusiasts around the world, trying to interrogate sort of the two premises of this vision of blockchain and DAOs. And one of those is that the trust, the trust advantage relative to sort of just giving money to a nonprofit, to an NGO doing the same thing. Would lead people to be more willing to give. The other was that the ability to participate in decision making beyond just sort of here's my money might be an inducement. To be honest, I'm not sure that a great swath of Earth's population, at least the folks we talk to, those are their felt needs. But it's also hard to tell, when you're presenting something that doesn't exist and nothing like it really exists.
Yeah.
It's very hard to do sort of user research for something that is a paradigm shift.
It's a fascinating idea. You've just literally described the function of NASA, but instead of government dollars, where the government is the governance part of it, what if we removed the sovereign? And NASA is a taxpayer funded organization, but what if there was, a non-sovereign, publicly funded space organization? That's very interesting. And that is the stuff of real science fiction that's happening in real time right now. Brian Israel, it was a pleasure just to kind of think about all of these things and the potential, but also the reality of what's happening, not only on Earth, but just looking up skyward into space for us. So that was really fascinating. Thanks for joining us on the show today.
Thanks, it's my pleasure.
And thank you everyone for joining us on this latest episode of Word on the Block. I'm Forkast.News Editor-in-Chief Angie Lau. Until the next time. You know what I'm going to say here, right? Like, comment, subscribe. We hope you do. I'm Editor-in-Chief Angie Lau, Forkast News. Subscribe for a lot more in-depth conversations. This is what we do for you every day. And here's the next one.